The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning, folded beneath a stack of seed catalogs and electric bills inside the rusted mailbox at the edge of the gravel road. Harold Bennett almost missed it. The paper looked official in the worst possible way, thick cream stock, sharp black lettering, the kind that always carried bad news before it was even opened. He stood beside the mailbox for a long moment while cold wind rolled across the empty soybean fields surrounding his property outside Millhaven, Iowa. The harvest had already been sold. The equipment loans were behind. And the county tax office had mailed 2 warnings in 3 months. Harold already knew what the letter probably said. Still, he opened it there. Notice of payment rejection. The words sat heavy against the page. The cashier's check he had submitted to Midstate Agricultural Bank 3 days earlier, every remaining dollar from his winter grain contract, had been marked invalid and removed from processing. The notice claimed the authorization signature connected to the account did not match the bank's archived records. The payment had been frozen. His property lien remained active. And unless the matter was corrected within 10 business days, foreclosure review proceedings could continue. Harold read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. Not because he didn't understand it. Because he did. The 82-acre farm had belonged to his family since 1951. His father bought it after returning from Korea with borrowed money and 2 tractors held together by salvaged steel parts. The land survived droughts, interest spikes, and 3 recessions. But now the pressure came differently, not from weather, but from paperwork. Harold folded the notice carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of his denim jacket. Then he drove into town. Millhaven wasn't the kind of place that changed quickly. The diner still closed at 2. The courthouse clock still lost 4 minutes every winter. And Midstate Agricultural Bank still occupied the same brick building it had since the 70s, with polished windows and a flagpole out front that leaned slightly west whenever storms rolled through. Inside, the air smelled like floor polish and old carpet. The young teller at the counter recognized Harold immediately. "Morning, Mr. Bennett." He nodded once. "Need to ask about a rejected payment." The teller's expression tightened almost instantly. Not rude. Just cautious. She glanced toward the office corridor before typing something into her terminal. "One moment." Harold stood quietly while customers shuffled behind him. A rancher in mud-covered boots filled out a deposit slip nearby. Somewhere deeper in the building, a printer clicked steadily like distant rain. Finally, the teller looked up. "Mr. Grayson can speak with you." Of course he could. Elliot Grayson had managed Midstate Agricultural Bank for nearly 14 years. He wore tailored gray suits in a county where most men owned more work gloves than neckties. People said he'd helped modernize the bank after regional consolidation brought outside investors into Millhaven. Others said he'd simply learned how to package pressure in polite language. His office sat behind a frosted glass door. "Harold," Grayson said warmly as he entered. "Please. Sit down." Harold remained standing. "My check got rejected." Grayson folded his hands across the desk. "Calm. Professional. Practiced." "Yes. Unfortunately, the authorization signature tied to the issuing account raised compliance concerns during verification. It was a cashier's check." "I understand. So how's it invalid?" Grayson leaned back slightly. "The issue isn't necessarily the funds themselves. It's the signature attached to the historical authorization file associated with the agricultural reserve account." Harold stared at him. The word sounded polished enough to confuse most people. But Harold had spent 40 years sitting across tables from grain buyers, insurance adjusters, and contract attorneys. He understood when someone was trying to bury a simple answer beneath complicated language. "You're saying the signature doesn't match?" "In simplified terms, yes. It's my account." Grayson gave a sympathetic nod. "And that's exactly why we're trying to resolve the matter carefully." Carefully. That word bothered Harold more than anything else. Because banks only moved carefully when liability entered the room. He reached into his jacket and removed the folded rejection notice. My payment clears this lien. Potentially. It does clear it. Grayson paused. Then he slid a document across the desk. Mr. Bennett, according to our archived lending files, the authorization rights attached to that reserve account may not have transferred solely to your name after the restructuring agreement signed in 1998. Harold frowned. What restructuring agreement? The farm debt mediation package between your father and Midstate Federal. My father died in '96. Grayson lowered his voice gently. The signature dispute appears connected to documents filed shortly after his passing. For the first time since entering the bank, Harold felt something colder than anger. Confusion. Real confusion. Because he had handled every estate document himself after his father's death. Every equipment transfer. Every acreage filing. Every tax certification. There had never been a restructuring agreement. At least not one he knew about. You saying somebody signed something after he died? No one's alleging misconduct, Grayson replied carefully. We're simply unable to validate the current authorization chain attached to the account. Harold looked down at the document on the desk. Halfway through the page sat a photocopied signature line. Thomas Bennett. His father's name. The signature looked shaky. Distorted. And dated 8 months after the funeral. The room suddenly felt smaller. Outside the office window, Harold could see the bank lobby moving normally. Customers talking quietly. Pens scratching paper. A woman laughing near the entrance. But inside the office, something had shifted. Because either the bank had made a catastrophic mistake years ago, or someone had relied on the fact that an old farmer's records were buried deep enough never to be questioned again. Grayson clasped his hands together. I strongly recommend resolving this quickly, Harold. Once foreclosure review advances beyond preliminary filing, these matters become significantly harder to stop. Harold lifted his eyes slowly. Then he asked the one question Grayson clearly hoped wouldn't come next. Who witnessed the signature? For the first time all morning, the banker hesitated. Elliot Grayson did not answer immediately. The hesitation itself told Harold more than words could. Most bankers answered simple procedural questions automatically. Dates. Witnesses. Filing departments. But Grayson's eyes shifted briefly toward the document before returning to Harold with the measured caution of someone deciding how much information was safe to reveal. The archived file references an internal compliance witness, he said at last. Name. I'd need authorization to release personnel details connected to historical records. Harold let out a slow breath through his nose. Funny thing about history, he muttered. Dead people usually don't sign paperwork. Grayson straightened slightly in his chair. Mr. Bennett, I understand this is frustrating. No, Harold replied calmly. Foreclosure's frustrating. Confusion ain't frustrating. Confusion's what people use when they're buying time. The banker's expression tightened almost invisibly. Outside the office, someone passed carrying a tray of coffee cups. The muffled sound of phones ringing drifted through the frosted glass. Everything inside Midstate Agricultural Bank continued moving with practiced normalcy while Harold felt 30 years of certainty beginning to crack beneath him. He picked up the photocopied page again. The signature looked wrong now that he studied it longer. Not completely fake. Worse than fake. It looked imitated. Like someone had copied the shape without understanding the rhythm behind it. Thomas Bennett always signed his last name heavily. The double letters in Bennett pressed deep and dark, almost carving through paper. This signature looked hesitant. Careful. Like a person trying not to make mistakes. When was this discovered? Harold asked. The authorization conflict surfaced during automated review after your payment submission. So nobody noticed for 28 years? The account remained dormant for long periods, Grayson said. These legacy agricultural reserve structures weren't digitized until after the regional merger. Harold nodded slowly, though the explanation only sharpened the unease gathering in his chest. Because old farm records didn't just disappear accidentally. Especially not at banks. Land meant collateral. Collateral meant leverage. And leverage meant records got protected carefully. "Can I get copies?" Harold asked. "Copies of what?" "All of it." Grayson folded his hands again. "The full archive request process may require several business days." "I'll wait. There are procedures." Harold leaned slightly across the desk. "My father's been dead 30 years. Somebody used his name after burial, and now my farm's tied to paperwork I've never seen. So I'm not real interested in procedures today." For a moment, silence settled between them. Then Grayson stood and moved toward a filing cabinet near the wall. He unlocked one drawer, removed a thin manila folder, and placed it carefully on the desk. "This is all we currently have in physical retention." Harold opened it immediately. Inside sat only 6 pages. Not contracts. Not transfer records. Just fragments. A partial restructuring summary. 2 authorization references. 1 routing confirmation. And a notarized acknowledgement page dated March 3, 1997. 8 months after Thomas Bennett's death. Harold's eyes stopped on the bottom corner. Witnessed by Caroline Pike. The name hit him unexpectedly. Caroline Pike had worked at Midstate years ago. Harold remembered her because she handled agricultural loan renewals back when his father still ran the farm personally. Sharp woman. Quiet. Always carried reading glasses on a silver chain around her neck. She retired sometime around 2004. Or at least that was the official story. "You know where she is?" Harold asked. Grayson's expression flattened again. "I wouldn't have personal information. But you know who she is. She was employed here many years ago. And she witnessed my dead father signing paperwork." Grayson's jaw shifted slightly. "The acknowledgement only indicates she verified file processing. That ain't what it says." Harold tapped the page. The wording was clear enough even through the faded photocopy. Witnessed and verified in person. He looked back up. "Did she ever question this?" "I couldn't say. But you could ask." Grayson walked back toward his chair slowly. "Mr. Bennett, I would strongly encourage you not to misinterpret archived procedural language. Older banking documents often used broader terminology than current compliance standards. Again with the polished language. Again with careful answers." Harold closed the folder. "When's foreclosure review?" Grayson paused. "The committee meets next Thursday." 7 days. Harold gave a short nod, tucked the documents beneath his arm, and headed toward the office door. "Harold," Grayson called behind him. He stopped without turning. "You should consider legal counsel before escalating assumptions that may not be supported by the complete record." Harold finally looked back. "That sounds like advice." "It is." "Then here's mine," Harold replied quietly. "If somebody forged my father's name to move land debt around, I'd stop calling it assumptions." He left the office before Grayson answered. Outside, the afternoon wind had picked up across Main Street. Dust rolled along the curb beside parked pickup trucks while church bells sounded faintly somewhere across town. Harold sat inside his truck for nearly 2 minutes without starting the engine. Then he unfolded the papers again. Caroline Pike. The name kept circling in his mind. He remembered one specific afternoon from years earlier. His father arguing inside the old bank lobby after drought losses nearly pushed them under. Caroline had brought coffee during the meeting and quietly corrected a loan officer who misquoted acreage numbers. Thomas Bennett trusted very few bank employees. But he trusted her. Which meant one of 2 things had happened. Either Caroline Pike knowingly approved fraudulent documents. Or she witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. Harold started the truck. Instead of heading home, he drove west past the grain elevator, across the railroad tracks, and toward the older neighborhoods near the river. Millhaven shrank quickly there. Smaller houses. Narrow streets. Yards lined with aging maple trees. He parked beside a faded white bungalow with peeling shutters. A mailbox near the porch still read Pike. For a long moment, Harold remained seated behind the wheel. Then he noticed movement behind the curtains. Someone was home. He climbed out slowly, boots crunching against gravel, and walked toward the porch carrying the folder beneath his arm like evidence too old to still matter. But somewhere deep down, Harold already knew something dangerous about small towns. The past never truly disappeared. It just waited for the right person to ask the wrong questions. Harold knocked twice. No answer came immediately, but the curtain shifted again near the front window. Whoever stood inside was watching carefully enough not to be seen directly. The house itself looked tired in the way many retired homes did around Millhaven, flower beds gone dry, porch paint fading beneath weather, gutters sagging slightly from winters nobody bothered fixing anymore. He waited. Finally, locks clicked behind the door. An older woman opened it halfway. Caroline Pike looked smaller than Harold remembered. Age had narrowed her shoulders and silvered her hair completely, though her eyes remained sharp behind thin reading glasses hanging from the familiar chain around her neck. For a second, neither spoke. Then recognition settled across her face. Harold Bennett. You remember me. Your father argued loud enough for half the county to remember him. A faint smile appeared briefly, but it vanished when she noticed the folder under his arm. You'd better come in. The living room smelled faintly of old books and cedarwood polish. Stacks of newspapers sat arranged neatly beside a recliner near the window. A muted television played weather forecasts nobody seemed to be watching. Caroline motioned toward the kitchen table. What happened? Harold laid the photocopies in front of her without speaking. She adjusted her glasses and began reading. Halfway down the first page, her expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. Real fear. She lowered the papers carefully. Where did you get these? Bank. They gave you copies? Not willingly. Caroline leaned back slowly in her chair. Outside, wind rattled dry branches against the side of the house. The sound seemed unusually loud in the silence that followed. My father died in '96, Harold said quietly. This signature's dated after the funeral. I can see that. Your name's on the witness line. Caroline removed her glasses. Her hands trembled slightly now. I was afraid this might surface someday. Harold said nothing. Because the moment she spoke those words, everything changed. Not suspicion. Confirmation. She stood slowly and crossed toward a cabinet near the sink. After fumbling briefly with a drawer, she removed an old metal cash box and carried it back to the table. The lock clicked open. Inside sat folders bound with rubber bands yellowed from age. Caroline selected one carefully. You remember when Midstate merged with Prairie Federal in the late '90s? Some. The merger wasn't stable. Agricultural defaults were rising all across the county. The new investors wanted cleaner balance sheets before state review. Harold frowned. What's that got to do with my farm? Your father owed less than most people thought, Caroline replied. That made his land valuable. She opened the folder. Inside were photocopied memos bearing Midstate letterheads, handwritten approval notes, and internal routing sheets stamped confidential. Harold's stomach tightened immediately. These came from the bank. I kept copies. Why? Caroline looked down at the papers for several seconds before answering. Because I realized too late what they were doing. Harold sat motionless. She slid one memo across the table. The document referenced agricultural reserve restructuring transfers connected to distressed land portfolios after the merger. Another paragraph mentioned reallocating dormant collateral obligations through inactive authorization files. The language sounded corporate. But the meaning beneath it was simple enough. Move debt quietly. Protect the bank. Use forgotten paperwork if necessary. Harold looked up sharply. They transferred somebody else's debt onto my property. Not directly, Caroline said carefully. They buried portions of unrecoverable obligations inside reserve structures connected to farms with old credit histories. My father never agreed to this. No, she replied softly. He didn't. The room fell silent again. Harold suddenly remembered the final year before his father died. Endless meetings at the bank. Arguments over refinancing terms. His father insisting certain documents weren't correct. Harold had assumed it was stress from illness and mounting bills. Now he wondered whether Thomas Bennett had already suspected something. Who signed it? Harold asked. Caroline's eyes drifted toward the window. His name was Richard Voss. Harold recognized it immediately. Voss had been regional director during the merger years. Ambitious. Educated. Always speaking about modernization and restructuring. He left Iowa years ago for corporate banking work in Chicago. What did he do? Caroline inhaled carefully before answering. He realized many older agricultural files existed only on paper. Some farms had unresolved reserve accounts dating back decades. Most families never reviewed them because the language was complicated and the balances stayed dormant. So he altered them. He called it administrative correction. Harold felt heat rising behind his ribs. You witnessed this. I witnessed documents arriving after your father's death. Her voice lowered. And I questioned them. What happened? Caroline gave a humorless smile. I was told not to confuse procedural recovery with fraud. The phrase sounded rehearsed. Like words repeated enough times to become permanent. Harold stared at the forged signature again. You could have reported it. I tried. That answer stopped him cold. Caroline opened another folder and removed a folded letter. It was addressed to the Iowa Division of Banking. Never mailed. They blocked it internally, she said. Voss claimed the documents were authorized through legacy estate transfer permissions. By the time legal review started, the merger was complete and most records had already been digitized. Then why keep copies? Because someday someone would lose everything over this. Harold leaned back heavily in his chair. Outside, clouds darkened over Millhaven. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window now, steady and cold. Who else knows? Probably no one alive in town except Elliot Grayson. Harold looked up sharply. Grayson was there. He was junior compliance staff during the merger. Young. Quiet. Mostly handled file indexing. And now he runs the bank. Caroline nodded once. The implications settled slowly between them. Not coincidence. Continuity. The same institution. The same buried records. The same land. Harold rubbed one rough hand across his jaw. Why surface it now? Caroline looked at him carefully. Because your farm matters again. What's that supposed to mean? Instead of answering directly, she stood and walked toward the living room window. Beyond the glass, rain blurred the street into gray streaks. You haven't heard about the rail expansion? Harold frowned. There's been rumors. It's more than rumors. She turned back toward him. A freight corridors coming through 3 counties. Agricultural transfer hubs. Storage facilities. Distribution terminals. The proposed route cuts within half a mile of your western acreage. Harold felt the pieces shifting together with sickening precision. Land values. Foreclosure pressure. Dormant debt. Invalid payment claims. Not random. Never random. Caroline spoke quietly now. If the foreclosure moves forward, the bank controls your property before the state acquisition reviews begin. Harold stared at the forged signature one final time. Then he understood the real danger. The old documents weren't mistakes buried by time. They were leverage. And someone had just tried to activate them before Harold Bennett realized what his land was truly worth. Rain followed Harold all the way home. The windshield wipers pushed slow arcs across the glass while muddy water pooled along the edges of the county road. Fields stretched dark and empty beneath the storm clouds, mile after mile of land Harold had spent his entire life trying to hold together. Now every acre felt uncertain. By the time he reached the farmhouse, dusk had settled over the property. The porch light flickered weakly against the rain while rusted machinery sat motionless beside the equipment shed like forgotten witnesses. Harold carried Caroline Pike's folder inside carefully. He spread the papers across the kitchen table beneath a hanging yellow light that hummed softly overhead. Most people would have seen nothing but banking jargon and procedural records. But Harold studied contracts the way farmers studied weather, slowly, patiently, looking for patterns others missed. And patterns were beginning to appear. The reserve account connected to his father's old loan had been modified 3 separate times between 1997 and 2001. Tiny numerical adjustments. Routing changes. Internal transfer codes. None large enough to attract scrutiny individually. But together, nearly $400,000 in distressed agricultural debt had quietly passed through authorization structures connected to Bennett farmland. Harold sat back heavily. His father had spent years believing the farm struggled because of drought losses and interest rates. But part of the pressure may have been manufactured. The thought made Harold physically ill. A truck engine sounded outside. Moments later, headlights swept across the kitchen window. His grandson, Luke, stepped through the front door carrying 2 grocery bags beneath his jacket. "You still awake?" Luke asked. Then he noticed the papers. What happened? Luke Bennett was 23, lean and broad-shouldered, with the same steady eyes Harold's father once had. He worked part-time repairing diesel engines in town while helping maintain the farm during planting and harvest seasons. Unlike most young people around Millhaven, Luke never talked much about leaving. Harold respected that. Which was exactly why he hated what came next. The bank rejected the payment. Luke set the groceries down immediately. What? Harold slid the documents across the table. Luke read quietly for several minutes, confusion hardening gradually into disbelief. "This signature's fake." "I know. They can't do that." Harold gave a tired smile. "Banks can do plenty before somebody stops them." Luke kept reading. Then he stopped abruptly near the merger memos from Caroline Pike's files. "Hold on." He flipped back 2 pages. "What's Western Corridor Holdings?" Harold frowned. "Where?" Luke pointed toward a routing authorization note buried near the bottom of one transfer summary. There it was. WCH Infrastructure Reserve Allocation. Harold hadn't noticed it before. "You know it?" he asked. Luke nodded slowly. "Diesel shop's been servicing contractors out near Cedar Junction. One of them mentioned a company called Western Corridor buying land options before the rail announcement becomes public." Harold felt tension tighten through his shoulders. "How much land?" "Thousands of acres probably. Maybe more." The room grew quiet except for rain striking the roof overhead. Luke lowered the papers carefully. "You think the bank's trying to take the farm before the rail deal hits?" Harold didn't answer immediately. Because saying it aloud made it real. Finally, he nodded once. Luke exhaled sharply and paced toward the sink. "This is criminal." "Maybe. So what do we do?" Harold looked again at the forged signature. Then at Caroline Pike's retained documents. And finally toward the old filing cabinet near the hallway. His father kept records obsessively. Tax receipts. Loan renewals. Feed invoices. Insurance forms. Everything dated, labeled, stacked carefully year after year. At the time, Harold thought it was stubbornness from an older generation that trusted paper more than computers. Now he wondered if Thomas Bennett had been protecting himself. "Help me move the cabinet," Harold said. Together they dragged the heavy metal cabinet away from the wall. Dust scattered across the floorboards while Harold unlocked the bottom drawer using an old brass key hanging beside the refrigerator. Inside sat dozens of folders. Some dated back 40 years. Luke knelt beside him while Harold sorted methodically through faded labels. Equipment tax 1988. Soil leases. Federal crop insurance. Drainage district. Then one folder stopped him cold. Mid-state mediation, private. Harold stared at it for a long moment before opening it carefully. Inside were handwritten notes in his father's blocky handwriting. Meeting summaries. Phone numbers. Names. And one sentence underlined twice in black ink. They keep changing the authorization language. Luke leaned closer. Another page contained a list of internal bank employees involved in restructuring meetings. Richard Voss. Caroline Pike. And Elliot Grayson. Harold's jaw tightened. His father knew. Maybe not everything. But enough to become suspicious before he died. Luke continued turning pages until a folded legal-sized document slipped free onto the table. At first glance, it looked insignificant. Just another authorization form. Then Harold saw the date. January 14, 1996. 6 months before his father's death. Signed at the bottom in dark blue ink. Thomas Bennett. This signature looked completely different from the forged version. Strong. Heavy. Unmistakably real. But that wasn't what made Harold's pulse quicken. Near the bottom sat an additional line stamped by a county notary office. Primary authorization rights non-transferable without direct successor confirmation. Luke looked up immediately. What does that mean? Harold read the line twice more. Then understanding hit him slowly. If this stayed attached to the account, he murmured, they couldn't legally move anything after his death without verified estate approval. Luke's eyes widened. So the fake signature covered the transfer. The rain outside intensified, hammering against the roof now. Harold continued examining the document carefully. Then he noticed something else. A second signature beneath the notary certification. Witnessed by County Recorder Ellen Shaw. Luke frowned. Is she still alive? Harold nodded slowly. Retired. Live south of town. For the first time all day, something shifted inside him that wasn't fear or confusion. Direction. Because forged paperwork mattered. But original paperwork mattered more. Especially when county verification entered the chain. Luke leaned forward. This could stop foreclosure. Maybe. You don't sound convinced. Harold folded the document carefully. Stopping foreclosure's one thing, he said quietly. Proving why they started it's another. A long silence followed. Then Luke asked the question both of them had been avoiding. What if Grayson destroys the rest? Harold looked toward the dark kitchen window. Toward the bank sitting silent in the center of Millhaven. Toward decades of buried records now suddenly worth protecting. He already would have, Harold said softly, if he knew what we found tonight. And somewhere across town, inside an office lit long after business hours, Elliot Grayson was likely realizing the exact same thing. The problem was no longer an old farmer behind on debt. The problem was surviving evidence. Harold barely slept. The storm passed sometime after midnight, leaving the farm wrapped in damp silence broken only by distant thunder rolling east across the plains. He remained at the kitchen table until nearly dawn, reading every page inside his father's private folder while Luke slept briefly on the living room couch. The deeper Harold looked, the clearer the pattern became. Thomas Bennett had suspected manipulation long before his death. Several handwritten notes referenced unexplained balance adjustments tied to reserve reallocations. One page described a closed-door meeting where Richard Voss insisted certain agricultural liabilities needed temporary administrative consolidation after the merger. Another line stood out even more. If I refuse transfer terms, they threaten accelerated review. Harold read that sentence 3 times. His father had been pressured. Not openly. Not crudely. Professionally. The kind of pressure institutions applied quietly enough to remain deniable. At 6:30 in the morning, Harold drove south toward the neighboring town of Fairwick. Fog hovered low across the county highway while grain silos emerged slowly from the mist like gray monuments. Ellen Shaw lived in a small brick duplex beside an old Lutheran church. Retirement had softened her appearance but not her posture. Even in her 70s, she carried herself with the rigid efficiency of someone who spent decades protecting public records from careless hands. She listened without interrupting while Harold explained everything. Then she examined the authorization form carefully beneath her kitchen light. "That's my seal," she said immediately. "And the signature? Thomas Bennett signed this in front of me personally." Harold felt relief move through him so sharply it almost hurt. "You remember it?" "I remember your father arguing about legal wording for nearly 40 minutes. Ellen allowed herself a faint smile. He didn't trust vague paperwork. Neither did Harold. "Would this still hold?" he asked. Ellen adjusted her glasses. "If the filing remained active in county records, yes. This clause would require direct estate confirmation before any authorization transfers occurred." Harold exchanged a look with Luke. "That never happened," Luke said. Ellen nodded slowly. "Then whoever processed later modifications would need additional documentation validating successor approval." Harold placed the forged signature photocopy beside the original form. Ellen's expression hardened almost instantly. "This isn't even close." "You're certain?" "The stroke pressure's wrong. Your father signed aggressively downward." She tapped the fake document. "This person copied appearance, not movement." Luke leaned forward. "Can you testify to that?" Ellen hesitated. Not because she doubted herself. Because she understood what testimony against a regional bank could become. "Officially," she said carefully, "I can verify the original authorization existed and remained valid when filed." "That's enough," Harold replied. But Ellen wasn't finished. "There's something else you should know." She stood and crossed toward a filing cabinet near the hallway. After searching briefly, she returned carrying an old county plat map folded inside protective plastic. She spread it across the table. Red markings crossed portions of western Millhaven County. Rail corridors. Transfer depots. Industrial access zones. Harold's stomach tightened immediately. The proposed freight expansion ran directly adjacent to Bennett farmland. Luke stared at the map. "That property value would triple." "More than triple," Ellen said quietly. "Once state infrastructure grants finalize, private acquisition groups will move aggressively." Harold suddenly understood the timeline perfectly. The foreclosure review wasn't about overdue debt alone. It was about control before public announcements triggered scrutiny. Ellen pointed toward a highlighted section near Harold's acreage. Western Corridor Holdings already filed preliminary transportation interest disclosures through state development offices last month. Luke frowned. "Then why hasn't anyone heard about it?" "Because the acquisition phase remains confidential until route approvals finish." Harold folded his arms slowly. "So the bank gets the farm cheap through foreclosure," he said, "then transfers it once expansion becomes public." Ellen didn't answer directly. She didn't need to. The silence confirmed enough. By noon, Harold and Luke returned to Millhaven carrying copies of every verified county filing Ellen could legally provide. The atmosphere inside town felt strangely ordinary considering how much suddenly rested beneath old paperwork. People bought feed supplies. Kids crossed streets after school. Pickup trucks lined the diner parking lot. And somewhere underneath all of it sat a regional bank preparing to absorb farmland tied to a multimillion-dollar corridor project. Luke parked near the courthouse. "We should get a lawyer." Harold nodded once. Already thinking the same. There was only one attorney in Millhaven known for fighting institutional cases instead of settling them quietly. Margaret Vale operated from a narrow second-floor office above an insurance agency near Main Street. Former state litigation counsel. Sharp reputation. Expensive. Harold carried the folders upstairs. Margaret listened for nearly an hour without speaking much. She examined the forged signature photocopies beside the original authorization forms, reviewed Ellen Shaw's verification statements, and read Thomas Bennett's handwritten notes carefully. Finally, she removed her glasses. "This is dangerous." Luke frowned. "For who?" "For everyone involved." Harold leaned forward slightly. "Can we stop foreclosure?" "Yes." The answer came immediately. "But preventing foreclosure and exposing fraud are different legal battles," Margaret continued. "Right now, the bank can still argue administrative confusion tied to legacy merger records." Harold slid Caroline Pike's confidential memos across the desk. Margaret read silently. Then her expression changed. "This," she said quietly, "is not confusion." The office fell silent. Margaret reorganized the papers methodically before speaking again. "If these internal memos are authentic, they establish deliberate manipulation of reserve liabilities tied to dormant agricultural accounts." Luke looked toward Harold. "Meaning?" "Meaning someone intentionally redistributed debt exposure using legacy authorization structures." Margaret paused. "Which crosses from civil misconduct into potential criminal fraud." Harold sat back heavily. For the first time, the scale of it became fully real. Not just his farm. Possibly dozens. Maybe more. Margaret closed the folder carefully. "When is foreclosure review scheduled?" "Thursday. That gives us 4 days." She stood and walked toward the window overlooking Main Street below. "Grayson will likely attempt emergency containment once he realizes external counsel is involved," she said. "Document preservation orders need filing immediately." Luke crossed his arms. "What if records disappear before then?" Margaret looked back toward them calmly. "If records disappear after notice is filed," she replied, "that becomes obstruction." Harold noticed something then. For the first time since opening the rejection letter, someone wasn't speaking cautiously anymore. Margaret returned to her desk. "I need complete copies of everything tonight," she said. "And Harold, until this hearing happens, do not speak privately with anyone from Midstate Agricultural Bank." "Why?" "Because once institutions realize leverage is failing," she said quietly, "they stop negotiating the same way." Outside the office window, a black sedan rolled slowly past the courthouse before disappearing around the corner. Harold watched it carefully. Then he recognized the driver. Elliot Grayson. And judging by the expression on the banker's face as he glanced briefly toward Margaret Vale's office windows, he already knew the fight had changed. By Thursday morning, word had already begun spreading quietly through Millhaven. Not the full story. Small towns rarely receive truth all at once. Instead, rumors moved in fragments through coffee shops, feed stores, and church parking lots. People heard that Harold Bennett hired Margaret Vale. Others heard Midstate Agricultural Bank delayed a foreclosure review unexpectedly. A few claimed state auditors were coming from Des Moines. Nobody knew exactly what was happening. But everyone sensed something larger than overdue debt. Harold arrived at the county administration building just before 9 o'clock carrying a cardboard records box beneath one arm. Luke walked beside him while Margaret Vale reviewed legal notes near the courthouse entrance. The foreclosure review itself was technically administrative, not criminal. 3 committee members. 1 compliance officer. 1 county representative. Mostly routine. Except routine cases didn't attract lawyers carrying evidence folders thick enough to require storage boxes. Inside the hearing room, fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Elliot Grayson sat near the far end of the table wearing another gray suit, though today the confidence looked thinner around the edges. 2 attorneys from Cedar Rapids occupied seats beside him, surrounded by organized binders and laptops. Grayson acknowledged Harold with a short nod. Harold ignored him completely. The committee chairwoman cleared her throat once everyone sat down. "This hearing concerns foreclosure review proceedings regarding Bennett Agricultural Property Parcel 11A through Midstate Agricultural Bank. Margaret rose immediately. Before review begins, she said calmly, my client moves for immediate suspension of proceedings due to evidence indicating materially defective authorization records tied to the underlying debt structure. One of the bank attorneys responded quickly. The institution disputes any allegation of material defect. Margaret slid copies across the table. Then the institution may explain why posthumous authorization transfers were executed using signatures inconsistent with verified county records. Silence settled instantly. The committee members exchanged uneasy looks while documents moved from hand to hand across the table. Grayson remained expressionless. But Harold noticed the banker's jaw tighten when Ellen Shaw's certification statement appeared. The chairwoman frowned down at the papers. These dates conflict. Yes, Margaret replied. Because Thomas Bennett was deceased when later transfer authorizations were processed. One bank attorney leaned forward carefully. Historical merger transitions occasionally generated clerical irregularities. This is not clerical, Margaret interrupted. She placed Caroline Pike's retained memos onto the table next. The room changed immediately. Even without legal training, everyone present understood the seriousness of internal documents referencing administrative debt consolidation through dormant agricultural accounts. The county representative removed his glasses slowly. Where did these come from? A former Midstate employee who retained copies after internal reporting concerns were ignored. Grayson finally spoke for the first time. These records lack authenticated chain verification. Margaret looked directly at him. Then I assume Midstate Agricultural Bank will cooperate fully with forensic review of archived originals. Another silence followed. Longer this time. Because everyone understood what that question really meant. Produce the records. Or explain why they no longer existed. The committee chairwoman adjusted the papers carefully. Mr. Grayson, she said slowly, did your institution process debt reallocations through inactive reserve accounts during the Prairie Federal merger? One of the attorneys immediately intervened. Midstate categorically denies unlawful conduct. That wasn't my question. Grayson inhaled carefully before answering. Legacy restructuring measures occurred throughout the regional consolidation period under then applicable agricultural recovery guidelines. Harold almost laughed. Even now, the man hid behind polished language. Margaret stood again. For clarity, she said, the bank acknowledges restructuring measures occurred. We further assert those measures included unauthorized liability transfers concealed beneath fraudulent successor authorizations. The bank attorney objected instantly. But the damage was already done. Because once the word fraudulent entered an official hearing record, everything shifted procedurally. The committee chairwoman requested a recess. Within minutes, the room emptied into tense hallway conversations beneath buzzing courthouse lights. Luke paced near the vending machines while Margaret spoke quietly with county officials farther down the corridor. Harold remained near the window overlooking Main Street. That was when Elliot Grayson approached him alone. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Grayson folded his hands calmly. You should have taken the settlement. Harold turned slowly. What settlement? The revised payment proposal we intended to offer after review. Harold stared at him. You mean after taking the farm? Grayson's expression hardened slightly. You think you uncovered some grand conspiracy. But you don't understand what those merger years looked like. Farms were collapsing everywhere. Banks were failing. People made difficult decisions to stabilize entire counties. By forging dead men's signatures. A flicker of irritation crossed Grayson's face. You know what happens when regional lenders collapse, Harold. Families lose operating credit. Equipment financing disappears. Payrolls fail. Entire communities die. So you picked who carried the damage. No, Grayson replied sharply. Voss did. The admission hung between them instantly. Real. Uncontrolled. And the moment Grayson realized what he'd said, it was already too late. Harold spoke quietly. You knew. Grayson looked away briefly toward the courthouse window. I knew enough not to ask certain questions. That answer carried more honesty than anything the banker had said since this began. Harold studied him carefully. Not a mastermind. Not entirely innocent either. Just another man who convinced himself institutional survival justified buried harm. You could have fixed it years ago, Harold said. Grayson gave a tired smile. You think banks volunteer liability? Before Harold could answer, Margaret appeared at the end of the hallway. Harold, she called firmly. Grayson stepped back immediately, professional composure returning like a mask sliding into place. The hearing resumed 20 minutes later. This time the committee's tone had changed completely. Foreclosure review proceedings against Bennett Farmland were suspended pending forensic examination of mid-state archival records. The county representative formally referred the documentation package to state banking regulators for external investigation review. Not victory. Not yet. But enough. Enough to stop the farm from disappearing quietly. Outside the courthouse, reporters from 2 regional newspapers had already arrived after hearing whispers about banking irregularities connected to agricultural properties. Cameras turned toward Harold as he exited. He ignored every question. Because the real moment came elsewhere. Across the street, farmers had begun gathering silently near the courthouse steps. Men Harold had known for decades. Families carrying the same debts, the same paperwork, the same trust in institutions that often spoke too carefully when land became valuable. One older rancher stepped forward first. Then he held out an envelope. My loan files started changing after the merger too, he said quietly. Another farmer nodded. So did mine. Harold looked around slowly. And for the first time, he understood the full scale of what had been buried beneath all those polished documents and legal phrases. The forged signature wasn't the entire story. It was simply the crack that finally let daylight reach it. 3 months later, investigators from the Iowa Division of Banking arrived at Mid-State Agricultural Bank with formal audit warrants. By then, Richard Voss had already hired corporate attorneys in Chicago. It didn't matter. Archived email recoveries, internal transfer logs, and deleted reserve allocation records began surfacing one after another. State investigators eventually identified 7 agricultural properties tied to disputed restructuring transfers during the Prairie Federal merger years. Some involved minor balance manipulations. Others didn't. The Bennett farm became the center of the inquiry because Thomas Bennett's original authorization form survived when most others had vanished. Caroline Pike testified voluntarily. So did Ellen Shaw. Neither woman spoke dramatically. They simply described procedures, signatures, dates, and records exactly as they remembered them. In the end, quiet truth carried more weight than polished explanations ever could. Elliot Grayson resigned before regulators completed final review. No criminal charges were filed against him personally, but state findings concluded senior compliance staff failed to report material irregularities tied to legacy agricultural restructuring accounts. Richard Voss faced civil fraud proceedings the following year. Harold Bennett never attended the hearings. He stayed on the farm. That spring, Luke repaired the western fence line while survey crews marked future rail boundaries beyond the soybean fields. Land values rose exactly the way Caroline predicted, but Harold refused every acquisition offer that arrived in the mail. Some things mattered more than money. One evening near sunset, Luke found him standing beside the old mailbox where the rejection notice first appeared months earlier. You ever think about selling now? Luke asked. Harold looked across the fields quietly. Then he shook his head once. Your great-grandfather used to say land remembers who protected it. The wind moved softly through the crops as daylight faded across Millhaven. And for the first time in many years, the Bennett farm no longer felt like borrowed ground.